Hello and welcome. I'm Carol Cram, host of the Art and Fiction podcast. This episode features Crystal King, author of In the Garden of Monsters, listed in the visual arts category on Art and Fiction. Crystal is also the author of The Chef's Secret and Feast of Sorrow, which was longlisted for the Center for Fiction's first novel prize and was a must-read for the Mass Book Awards. She is an author, culinary enthusiast, and marketing expert, and has taught at multiple universities, including Harvard Extension and Boston University. She lives in Boston. Welcome to the Art and Fiction podcast, Crystal.
Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. I think what I loved most about In the Garden of Monsters was how you combined fantasy and mythology with art, and of course, the larger than life persona of Salvador Dalí. Tell us about the genesis of In the Garden of Monsters.
So, I was struggling to sell a book about a Renaissance meat carver, this guy named Vincenzo Cervio, and I was researching Caprarola nearby. And and I had gone to this really wild garden during the time I was doing that research. Fast forward a couple of years, and I during the pandemic is when I wrote that book. We started selling it right after the pandemic ended, and it just wasn't selling. It wasn't selling. And I was really frustrated. And my editor came back to me and said, well, Renaissance historical fiction is just not a thing right now. And so, sorry, I'm going to pass. And that was 2 weeks before Maggie O'Farrell's Marriage Portrait hit the bestseller charts. So, but I was really frustrated. And I was talking to a friend of mine, Chris Walder, and
Yeah.
she has a couple books that are Gothic fiction, The Lost History of Dreams and Unnatural
Yeah.
Creatures, which is about the women of Frankenstein. And I was like, if I was going to write something that was going to sell, what should I write? She said, well, Gothics are hot, because of course she would
Yeah.
say that. And I thought immediately of that garden, this place in Bomarzo, Italy, the Sacro
Yeah.
Bosco, which means the little wood or sacred wood. And I thought that is the perfect place to set a Gothic. And then I started going back through my photos of the time that I had been there and realized that there are statues to Hades and Persephone in the garden. Well, there's a mouth of hell, which represents the way to get to Hades. There's a statue of Demeter that is staring right into the mouth of hell, waiting for Persephone. And there's a bench of Persephone that's in the garden, as well as other monsters, Cerberus and dragons and
Yeah.
sirens and so I was like, okay, that's interesting. Hades and Persephone. And then I discovered that Salvador Dali had gone there in
Yeah.
1948 and he filmed this tiny little movie, which is super interesting. It's maybe a minute to 3 minutes long. And I thought, okay, if I were going to push this all into one story, what would it look like? And In the Garden of Monsters took me about a year to write. I was just really thrown right into it.
Wow, that's quite quick, actually. Is
Yeah,
that quick for you?
it is, yes. My previous books took me a lot longer, but I just really loved this story. I had such a good time writing it.
Yes, I actually saw that video of Dali in the Garden of Monsters. It's great. Yeah, that actually put it on the map, didn't it?
Yeah, so if people want to see it, they can go to my website, crystalking.com, and I have a page to Dali and a page of the garden, and it's on both of those. But that movie, it was like when they used to show little tiny movies before the big cinema feature,
Yeah.
and that was probably how people saw it back then. And it sparked the interest and the imagination of the world. Let me tell you a bit about the garden first. So, the Sacro Bosco was created in the late 1500s by this guy, Vicino Orsini. And when he died, the garden was overgrown for almost 400 years. And it was owned by some rich Italian families, the Della Roveres and the Borgheses. And in the early 20s, 30s, 40s, all these surrealist artists and poets like Jean Cocteau and Max Ernst and a few other people, they all caught wind of this weird surreal garden and wanted to go check it out. And so that's why Dolly went there. He was in town doing sets for the Rome Opera and heard about this
Yeah.
garden from a friend of his, so he went there. And so that movie, it made people aware of the garden for the first time. And this couple, the Bettini family, they bought the garden and they renovated it. And that was in 1954. 2004, I think. And so now anybody can go see it. It's a bit off the beaten path, but it's only an hour north of Rome and it's worth the visit.
Yes, well, I have been there, as I mentioned to you before we
Yeah.
started, because my husband's a surrealist. He's known as a
Mhm.
surrealist painter. And so, because Max Ernst went there, which is his like ultimate, we had to go to Bomarzo. So we hope to go there again. And actually, I want to talk just a little bit about surrealism before we start talking a little more about your novel. So tell us a little bit about surrealists and also Dali's version of it, because of course he was kicked out of the official surrealist group, wasn't he?
Yeah, I so my husband's an artist, but he works for an art school here in Boston, and so I was somewhat familiar with
Yeah.
surrealism, and I love a lot of like modern and contemporary art and like 20th century and beyond, basically. And so I've always liked it, but I was never that much of a fan of Dali. The melting clocks just seemed overdone, and I just a lot of the other stuff I just really wasn't as excited about. And but when I started thinking, should I include him? I of course I did a really big deep dive. I read his autobiographies. I read biographies of other people who knew him. I started trying to understand, how he thought about the world as an artist. And then the more I learned about him, the more I wasn't sure if I wanted to include him because he is problematic. He would have been canceled in like 2 seconds today. He was kicked out of the Surrealists because of his fascist interests, I guess.
He admired Franco, didn't he?
Yes, he admired Franco. He
Probably
admired
not a good thing
he has a
that
painting
time.
called Hitler masturbating. So he was just problematic. Also, too, he wrote a letter to Paul Eulard, the poet,
Yeah.
who was one of the big surrealists, and it was a letter that outlined a religion that excluded Black people. And that
Oh
was
my
kind of like the
goodness.
straw that broke the camel's back. They were like, dude, you're done. So he left. So I wasn't sure I really wanted to include him because I myself don't want to be canceled.
Well, no, of course not.
What I did is I tried to play upon the strange and awful nature of Dali while recognizing the fact that he was somebody in life that was very charismatic. He was fascinating to other people. He was a brilliant, brilliant artist. He was
Yes, he was.
absolutely one of the most influential artists of the 20th century. There's just no two ways about it. And there was a lot there that I could do with that. And his wife, Gala, is interesting. She was
Yeah.
an astute businesswoman, but she was mean. And he worshiped her. He worshiped the ground she walked on. She was his muse. Everything in his life revolved around her, and his paintings reflect that. He has a tarot deck
Yeah.
that she's the empress on the card. He dedicated the cookbook to her, Daenerys de Gala, which I include in the book. And they were just a fascinating couple to write about.
Oh, they really are, and I think that was one of the most fun things about the novel was your portrayal of the Dalis and the way he speaks about himself in the third person, and she
Yeah,
is so awful.
I
Gala
tried
is
to
so
stay true to
awful.
that, but he's hard.
Yeah. But you did treat the fact that he was not the best guy in the world as well, but it didn't matter. It still worked really well in the novel. He was fascinating. And as you said, he had an amazing influence on modern art.
He
Yeah, go
painted
ahead.
pomegranates too. He
Yes.
loved pomegranates. He loved food. And so several of his paintings, including the bee around the pomegranate, there's a like
Yeah.
the one of his most famous paintings. I can never remember the name of it because it's really long. But there's the
Yeah,
bee with
they
the
are.
gun and the pomegranates and Galah's like naked laying around and there's a lion gonna devour her. But he has other paintings, pomegranate seeds in it. So he was kind of a natural fit in that regard.
Yes, and of course the pomegranate plays a huge role in the novel, which
Yep.
I couldn't figure out for the longest time, and I guess you're not supposed to figure that out until towards the end. So what was the thing with the pomegranates without having a spoiler?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a Hades and Persephone retelling. So if you're familiar
Yes.
with the myth, you probably can figure out a bit early on. But what I've found is a lot of people aren't familiar with the myth, which I was sort of surprised by because I love the Greek and Roman myths and the ancient stories. And so
Yeah.
to me, I just grew up with those. I had heard them and read them over and over. But just a really quick rundown of what the myth is, because it's also interesting. The other thing that I found fascinating about learning about the myth itself is that it's not actually a Greek myth, it's a Sicilian myth. And that's
Oh,
because Mount Etna is the home, it's the entrance to hell. So that's where Hades lives, is under Mount Etna. And the story is about this. Hades one day sees this beautiful young woman,
yeah.
Persephone, who is gathering flowers at the base of the volcano. And he goes to his brother Zeus, the king of the gods, and says, "Hey, I want that girl. I want her for my wife." And he says, "Okay, great. That's your sister's daughter, but you can have her because Demeter is also their sister. The Demeter was Persephone's mother, and she's Mother Nature essentially. And
Yes.
Persephone is considered to be a goddess of nature. And so he goes and takes Persephone, and art loves this story because if you go back through history, there's countless paintings. One of the most famous and most beautiful sculptures in the world, in my opinion, is Bernini's Repa Proserpina, which is
Oh,
in the
absolutely. In the
Borghese.
Borghese. Yeah.
And it's like the most incredible sculpture. It's Hades forcefully taking her into the underworld,
Mm,
and you can see like the marble looks like his fingers on
mm,
her flesh look real. They don't look like marble. And artists love telling this story. And there are some versions of the myth that sometimes she potentially falls in love with him. And even in the ancient times, there was some, hint that that could have happened, or at least she fell in love after she got there and that she became a dutiful wife in some way. And in modern days, we love the love stories. So, but the way that he kept her in the underworld is the interesting part. And so when Demeter discovered that her daughter was missing, she originally was searched the world looking for her, and she blanketed the world in snow on a layer of white, and all of the livestock and the plants and everything started dying. People started dying, and Zeus goes to his sister and says, "You can't do that. What are you doing? Stop this." And she's like, "Where's my daughter?" And he says, "Oh, yeah." And goes to Zeus and says, "You should let her have her daughter back because we can't have the world dying." And Heidi says, "Oh, well, except for the fact that she's eaten some pomegranate seeds. And for every pomegranate seed that she has eaten, she's supposed to stay in the underworld." And so some stories say three, some say six. I use six in my story
mm.
for the sake of the plot. So it seems that Hades had a trick up his sleeve when it came to keeping her in the underworld. So Persephone had eaten six pomegranate seeds. And so for every pomegranate seed that she had eaten, she has to stay in the underworld. And so they came to kind of a truce. And so Persephone would go back into the overworld for some of the time. And when she was in the underworld, Demeter would blanket the earth with snow because she's grieving for the loss of her daughter. When she's getting ready to come back, it's spring and she's like getting very excited about this. In summer, she's there and Demeter is super happy. And in the fall, things are starting to look bleak because she's going to go back into the underworld. And so it's the story of the seasons. And I just had a good time playing with that. But I was really interesting to me that a lot of people weren't familiar with the myth.
Well, I wasn't. And it's interesting because right at the end, of course, and no spoilers, it all wraps up. And I went, oh, that's where it was going. But I'm actually glad I didn't know really anything. I had no clue what it was about. I just knew it was about art and it had Dali in it. And there was all sorts of interesting things in Bomarzo. So I thought, yeah, perfect art and fiction.
What I just
Yes.
told you is not what happens in the book.
No, no, yeah, that is true. You did change it. But I'm just saying that I really enjoyed the novel, even knowing nothing about it. So I think my point is that you
Excellent.
don't need to know the myth. And in a way, it was almost more enjoyable because I had no idea what was going on
Excellent. Perfect.
in a good way. So let's talk a little bit about food because food is a huge part of this
So
novel. You
much
obviously
food.
really like food. And so tell us about that and why so much of it.
So my first two novels are about culinary figures in history. One of
Yes.
them is Apicius, and he is in the center of my novel, Feast of Sorrow, and his name is on the oldest known cookbook. He's this ancient Roman gourmand. And then I fast forwarded into the Renaissance, and I have a story about Bartolomeo Scoppi. he wrote a cookbook that was published in 1570 that was a best-selling cookbook for almost 200 years after he died. And he was a chef to several popes and cardinals. He probably fed Michelangelo. So he was somebody that was my second book. And then I have two other novels about other historical culinary figures in Italy that have yet to be published. So keep your fingers crossed for me. But I had all this research that I had done on Italian food throughout the centuries. And so when it came to having to get Persephone or this model, Julia, who has Salvador
Not
Dalí has taken
again.
this model, Julia, to the
Uh,
garden, and he's convinced that she is Persephone, and he's painting her as Persephone, and he wants her to eat these pomegranate seeds. So I had a whole bunch of research from all of the work I had done on my previous novels about food in Italian culinary history. And when it came to the idea of this book, I was playing with how Salvador Dalí has taken this model Julia to this garden of stone monsters, and he's going to paint her as Persephone. And in the book, he's kind of convinced that she might be Persephone. And so there's these elaborate meals that happen every day, and there's a host that is taking care of them in the garden, this guy Ignacio, who is very charismatic and handsome. There's a bunch of love stories going on, or some love affair things happening. It's a very sexy book too.
yeah,
And so I liked the idea that Dali is trying to get her to eat these pomegranate seeds. And Ignacio is providing all this wonderful, incredible food. So I have all these feasts that I take from throughout history because it's a
yes.
fantastical novel. The feasts are a little bit over the top, particularly on the dinners that Dali has a hand in.
Mhm.
And I take one of the dinners is actually based upon some of the ideas that come out in his cookbook, Dinners de Gala, which was published well, the cover says 1971, which is when he painted that, but I think it was actually published in 73. And
Yeah.
it's a whole bunch of French complicated recipes from restaurants that are still alive, like Maxim's in Paris, mostly these
Wow.
French Parisian restaurants. They're very difficult to make. And I just had fun with these dinners. And so I created some of the recipes from the book. There are actually some recipes in the book itself.
Yes, I saw that. That's awesome.
And I have a downloadable cookbook on my site where so people can
Huh?
recreate some of the dishes. And those are from food bloggers, historians, and chefs, and myself.
So would you like to do a reading from In the Garden of Monsters?
Sure. And I'm going to start actually at the beginning
Good
because
place.
it's a good place to start and it doesn't spoil too much. That's the challenge with this book I have found, is that if I get into too many places, it's a little spoilery. So this is from the prologue, and unlike some prologues, you should not skip this one. Don't skip it because it's important. It gives
No.
you a lot of context. And it starts in Bomarzo, Italy in 1547. 1547 to 1560 is what the prologue takes place, but we're talking about 1547 here. It took me years to find Julia Farnese, but no time at all to win her confidence. I did so with an unassuming cherry rose tart. It had been nearly 100 years since I last looked upon her face, but from the moment she pulled the golden tines of her fork away from her lips and she looked at me, and not her husband, I knew my influence had taken hold. You truly are a maestro, Adonis, she said, closing her eyes to savor the sweet floral flavors, and a welcome addition to our kitchen. Madonna Farnese, you flatter me. I gave the couple a polite bow, my gesture more fluid than human custom, and turned back to my earthly duties. It seems you will eat well while I am gone, Vicino joked behind my back. But don't eat too well, my beauty, or you won't fit into those lovely dresses. Julia laughed, and my heart warmed. Oh, she would eat well, I vowed, very well. And so I will just leave it there.
Oh, good little teaser. Wow. And I love your main character, of course, is called Julia, and she has no memory of her past, right?
Right.
So there's how does memory play a role, do you think, in this novel?
So I play with memory a lot.
Yes.
It's a big part of the plot. So there's two Julias that you've heard about. You've heard about Julia Farnese in 1547, but then also you meet Julia, a young American living in Rome with her roommate Lillian. And she doesn't have a lot of history in her mind. And you
Yes.
learn this pretty early on.
Yes.
She decides to take the Bomarzo job because she's a student at the academia in Rome, and she wants to learn from him. She's obsessed with surrealism. She's obsessed with the way that the surrealists play with time and visual everything, and just the idea of imagination is such a thing for surrealists. And so she
Yes.
is very attracted to this. So she goes because she has this sense that going to paint with Dali or model for Dali will be really important for her and in a way that might help her figure out what is going on with her missing memory. And I can't tell you too much, but
No.
the book is struggling with this idea of like what kind of memory does she have? What memories do other characters might potentially have? Are your memories really real? Are,
Yeah.
can you connect to them in a true way or not? Yeah. So,
And actually, one thing interesting to her, she wants to be an artist. She is an artist. And Dali, in the book and in real life, had very little time for women artists.
and
So,
yeah,
which was,
but he put up with them. I mean, there's
yeah,
pictures of Lee Miller that she took of him and Gala, so like he certainly appreciated some women as
yeah.
because they were in some circles together. I mean, he certainly probably knew Frida Kahlo and he knew, some of the other.
Dorothea Tanning, probably. I mean,
Yeah.
there's
I mean,
lots of women surrealists.
yeah, and poets at the time too.
Yeah.
So, but he did not believe that they should be artists. He believed that
No.
they were better as muses.
Yeah.
He loved women, but he didn't want to touch them. He just liked to look at them.
Yeah.
He liked to watch. One of my favorite quotes from Dali is, or funniest, I think, is how he talks about sex. He said that he's only had sex twice, and one was with the poet Pico Garcia Lorca, and one was with his wife Gala. And Lorca was painful, and Gala was underwhelming. So
Really?
he just was not interested in the physical act of sex himself. He
Wow.
let Gala have as many
Yeah, she had lots of
encounters.
lovers. Yeah.
Yes, and into her old age when they
Yeah.
would be like, "Okay, I'm going to get something more out of this than you will." So, like, he bought her a castle in a little bit away from their house in Pubal, Spain, and
Yeah.
he could only visit if she had given him a written invitation. And
Wow.
this is in like when she's in her 70s. And
Yeah.
one of the lovers that she had was the young star of Broadway's Jesus Christ Superstar. He was like in his
Oh,
20s.
really?
And he made off with a bunch of Dali paintings at the end of that relationship. So, yeah. Interesting.
He is such a character. I mean, we're kind of glad that he was in the world.
Yeah.
He certainly made a
I am.
contribution. So, one of my goals with the Art in Fiction podcast is to inspire other authors. So, what's one thing that you've learned all your novels that you didn't know before you started?
Oh gosh, so much.
Yeah.
I really do think butt in the chair as
Yes.
often as you can makes a difference. My first novel took me like 5.5 years, and I mostly wrote it on weekends, and I just kind of piddled my way through it. And I mean, and I rewrote it many times, but it took me a long time to get that first draft done. And at some point, I realized this is really what I'd love to do
Yeah.
as a career. That is not an easy prospect. If anyone has been writing, they know that's difficult. And there's two things that need to happen or that should happen to make this occur. Either you're lucky or you're prolific. And so
Yeah.
one of those two things, and I only have control over being prolific. And so I decided the only way I was going to do that is if I wrote every day. And, people like Stephen King is like, you should write every day. You have to write every day. And I don't think you have to write every day. And I don't always write every day. But I thought, okay, if I were going to write every day, what would that look like? And so I chunked that out into 400 words a day.
Yeah.
And if I do that every morning, or I sit down, I either write or edit for an hour or 400 words, whichever comes first. And I find that what happens is the story starts to really live in your head. and
Yeah.
you start to think about the characters and the plot in a way that is so beneficial because you're ruminating on it all the
Yeah.
time when you're not sitting in front of that computer. And so that drastically changed not just how fast I could write, because if you do that every morning, that's a book a year. 400 words a
Yep.
day is a book a year.
It
Um,
is.
but I also wrote better books because you're in it, you're
You're
thinking
in
it,
it.
you're believing it. So that would be my advice. If you can, chunk it into the smallest amount that you can manage every day and try for that because I think it just enhances your writing so much.
No, and I totally believe that. And it's consistency. You're right. Yeah, living within the novel. I'm in the middle of writing a first draft right now, which is so much fun because I haven't actually done that for a long time. I've been working these other two that are finally done.
Yeah,
But yeah,
the
editing and writing are
editing.
two different things. And
Yeah.
it's really exhilarating, isn't it, when you're writing it for the
When you're
first draft, you know?
starting that excitement, yeah.
I mean, you kind of know I do know what's going to happen, but I'm
You're
not a
not
huge
tired of the
outliner, but I
story
know.
yet.
Yeah. And you just don't know what they're going to do every day. But yeah, it's consistency. Do it every day. I wish I did it every day. I do it almost every day.
Yeah, even several times a week is better than,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
one day on the weekend.
So, what are you working on now, if you want to share that with us?
So I have a novel coming out next year, probably in the
Oh, great.
December timeframe. This one has a lot of history in it. It's not historical and there's no food in this one, which is weird
No,
for me. Very
but is
weird.
there art?
There is some art, yes. What it is, and it's contemporary. It's set actually like right before COVID and kind of as COVID's beginning. And it's a story about a woman who takes an unusual job in Rome, and she's
Oh,
she's cataloging artistic and historical places and things for this mysterious benefactor. And
oh,
basically, the gist of the book is that it's a story about gods that are stealing happiness from the world. It's kind of a
hmm,
reverse Pandora's box. And so we're still like in the final edits for that. I know they're working on like figuring out who the cover designer is,
yeah.
and I don't have a title yet, or I'd give that to you. But it's
So you're in the fantasy area still.
yeah, I'm kind of playing with that and toying with
Yeah,
that. It's something I've always really loved. And living in
yeah.
Boston, which is a very literary city, it's
Oh,
like
yeah.
I mean, very heavily literary. And when I
Mhm.
started writing and doing work with the writing community here, writing in fantasy was not cool. It was just you don't write genre. It was not acceptable. It
Oh
was
no.
not good writing. It was terrible. And I did not want to be seen like that. But
Mhm.
I've always enjoyed stories that are strange and speculative and fantastical and I read very widely and I love history, clearly, or I wouldn't write in it. And I like the idea of playing with both of those. All my novels, I think, will always have an Italy component. That will be the one thread that runs through it. And I'll never really get away from the history. Even the
Yeah.
book that I'm starting to noodle on now, which is set in Venice, and it's
Oh,
not historical, it has historical things in it. Like, because
yes.
you can't get
You
away
kind
from
of
that
have
in
to
Italy.
in Venice.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think now we're kind of able to be a little bit more eclectic. It used to be, oh, you
Yeah.
could never do genre, but I don't think that's the case anymore. Like your book is literary, but it's got a fantastical element, it's got a Gothic element,
Mythology.
it's
It's like
mythology. It's awesome. And that's I see that more and more. It's
bookstores don't know where
interesting.
to put it on the shelves. And so
Well, that's their problem. But yeah,
So,
I know.
but it's funny. I go into different bookstores. I'm like, where is my novel? And they're like, oh, it might be
Oh
here.
yeah.
And then I'll find it in fantasy. It's like, it's very funny.
Yeah, because it doesn't really fit in fantasy. It has fantasy in it, but it's not fantasy.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
as you know, the Historical Novel Society conference in June, because I'm on the
Mhm.
board, is historical fiction in its many forms. Because we recognize that there's so many different routes into historical fiction, like fantasy and thrillers and mysteries, romance. So we're kind of looking at all of those genres together.
Yeah. And I think it's also a really good way to get younger people interested in history is
Yeah,
there's that crossover because I really didn't get as interested into history until I was like probably my 30s. As you mature, you start to look at the world a little bit differently. You start to
Yeah.
become curious about things. How do things get this way? How do we not have things go this way again? Clearly, people aren't reading enough history these days.
Yeah. Not everybody reads history, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I think it's a great way to like, sneak it in for people
Yes.
that think it might sound too stodgy and too boring, but it's not,
Oh my
history.
goodness, no.
There's so
History is
many
awesome.
stories. Yeah.
So many stories. Well, thank you so much, Crystal, for chatting with me today. It's been just delightful.
Thank you for having me. I always love like, chatting and talking and connecting to my readers. So thanks for giving me that opportunity.
I've been speaking with Crystal King, author of In the Garden of Monsters, listed in the visual arts category on Art and Fiction at www.artandfiction.com. Be sure to check the show notes for a link to Crystal's website at www.crystalking.com, where you'll find pictures of Bomarzo, where the novel is set, and more information about Salvador Dalí. If you are enjoying the Art and Fiction podcast, please help us keep the lights on by making a donation to the Ko-fi website. The link is in the show notes. Also, please follow Art and Fiction on Facebook and Instagram. And don't forget to give the Art and Fiction podcast a positive review or rating wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening.